Hello, everyone. Welcome to our program, Object Focus Archangel Michael Ivory. My name is Dany Chan, and I am the Associate Curator of Asian Art at the Walters Art Museum. Today, I am joined by my colleague, Julie Lauffenburger, Director of Conservation, Collections, and Technical Research at the Walters, and Dr. Florina or Nina Capistrano-Baker, Consulting Curator at the Ayala Museum in the Philippines. For this program, each of us will offer our different perspectives on one object in the Walters collection, that being a Filipino ivory sculpture of the Archangel Michael that embodies the rich interconnections that spanned 4 continents during the 17th century. For my presentation, I will look at the sculpture's journey from its Asian origins into the Walters collection here in Baltimore. Julie will focus on the materiality of ivory, the sculpture's construction, and its conservation history. In her presentation, Nina will trace the transmission of the Michael image that connected empires within a global exchange. We are delighted to have Nina speak on this topic, as she brings over 2 decades of research and expertise on the Philippines within a meta-narrative of global exchange. She investigates historical patterns and genealogies of forms, cultural hybridity, and renegotiated identities. So support for this program and the Walters Art Museum is made possible through the combined generosity of individual donors, foundations, corporations, and grants from the City of Baltimore, Maryland State Arts Council, citizens of Baltimore County, Howard County Government, and Howard County Arts Council. Please note that this program is being recorded and will be available on the museum's YouTube channel and Facebook page. Welcome, Nina. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you.
All right, so are we ready to delve into the program? Let's do it. So I'm going to start us off by first looking at the sculpture and tracing its journey from its creation to life in the collection of the Walters Art Museum. So here is an image of this sculpture. It was made in the Philippines in the 17th century. It is made in ivory, and it depicts the Archangel Michael. So in Catholic traditions, Michael acts as the defender of the church, and he assists people at their hour of death. So here I've presented a passage from Revelations 12, which is the 12th chapter of the book of Revelation in the New Testament of the Christian Bible. So this passage describes the appearance of Michael and his battle with the devil. So it reads, "And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him." So the first question that I have to ask of this sculpture is, why did the Catholic image of Michael even appear in this Asian context? So part of the answer can be found in the Philippines' colonial history. So the Philippines is an island country of Southeast Asia in the Western Pacific Ocean. It takes its name from Philip II, who was the King of Spain when Spain colonized the islands in the 16th century. The Catholic religion was also propagated here as part of Spain's colonial enterprise, and it took hold as the Philippines remained a predominantly Catholic country. And so the Archangel Michael, as he was described in the book of Revelations, is really represented here. So we see Michael with wings, and he stands upon a serpentine demon. In one hand, he holds aloft a double-edged sword with a wavy blade. And it's very likely describing the Filipino callus blade. His other hand would have held scales for weighing souls. So the gray marble base upon which he stands is carved a depiction of hell. So on the left side, we see a full body view of his backside. So we can see that the wings are plain, undecorated, and there are armatures across the wing. So all of these features highly suggest that the sculpture was not meant to be shown completely in the round. Now, such an image of Michael would have been displayed in a church among other holy figures, inspiring faith in the worshipers and reminding them of the consequences of sin. So we're going to go through some detailed shots of this beautifully gilded sculpture. So Michael's face and his exposed arms and legs are highly polished, and that really exploits the lustrous potential of the ivory material. And his curls, which are gilded, tumble down to his shoulders. Michael wears a skirted tunic with short sleeves, a breastplate, and a scarf draped over his shoulder and gathered on his hip. Now, the decorations that we find on his costume include scrolls, stripes, zigzags, and rosettes. A red sun and a gold moon and stars also adorn his breastplate. Now, the square collar that you see is bordered with ovals and lozenges in red and black, and it's on a gold band. And there's also a raised faceted gem that's represented in its center. So on his feet, Michael wears calf-length boots adorned with winged little cherub heads. And the demon here has wings and a serpentine tail, really recalling the description of the devil and Satan as a serpent. The demon's head, arms, and torso are human, and it has an expression of pain, exposing its teeth. And we also see a red wound in its abdomen here in this picture. Now, we surmise that the stone base was either taken from another sculpture and adapted for the Michael sculpture, or it was carved for it, but only after the sculpture was exported out of Asia. Now, nearly every aspect of the story of this sculpture is tied to Spain's colonial enterprise and the 17th century trade network called the Manila Galleon Trade. Spain devised this network to connect the Philippines in Asia, Mexico in the Americas, and Africa with Europe. This was a network that actively moved across the globe materials, images, and ideas, as well as a wide variety of people, among them missionaries, artisans, and enslaved persons. So the story of Michael began in East Africa, where the ivory was extracted from elephants that were killed for their tusks. The African ivory was shipped to Asia, including Goa, India, Macau, China, and workshops in Manila in the Philippines, where immigrant Chinese artisans shaped the raw materials. So in her presentation, Julie will go into more detail of the sculpture's construction and the materiality of ivory during her presentation. So once the sculpture was finished, it was then transported on the Manila Galleon ships to the Americas. Now from here, the sculpture followed two possible paths. It was either sold in Acapulco, Mexico, alongside other Asian luxury goods, such as porcelain, silk, and spices, or the sculpture traveled across the Atlantic to be sold in Spain. Now we know that this sculpture did indeed make it to Europe, for Henry Walters purchased the sculpture in Italy. So in addition to the Archangel Michael sculpture, the Walters also have a collection of other Christian ivories shown here in this picture, made in the Philippines and made in Goa, India. So these ivory sculptures depict the Virgin Mary, who is Christ's mother, the Virgin and the Christ child together, or the Christ child alone. Now, beginning in the 16th century, several religious orders of the Catholic Church ventured from Europe on missionaries to the newly colonized territories in Asia. And I've mentioned Goa, India, Macau, China, Nagasaki, Japan, was it the other one, and Manila in the Philippines. So these missionaries included the Jesuits, the Franciscans, the Augustinians, and the Dominicans, all with the stated goals of spreading the Catholic faith around the world. Along with the Catholic doctrine, these missionaries brought with them the traditions of European art, which then were infused with local artistic styles and traditions. During her presentation, Nina will go into more detail on the stylistic hybridization that resulted from these exchanges. Certainly, some of these images were used for worship and teaching in the Asian territories. Many were also exported to Catholic countries in Europe and the Americas. So with this interconnected history of the sculpture in mind, I want to call your attention to a mystery that still remains about this object. So if you can see along the hem of the skirted tunic here, there's an incised and painted inscription that we've transcribed it as such: Sarabados, Barbotan, Serare, Periovum, Sequato, Periovum, 1303. Now, this inscription has, puzzled us for many, many years, and we've consulted a few scholars on the possible languages that is shown here. So the first obvious language that we thought it could be would be Latin, because it sounds pseudo-Latin, but it is really not quite Latin. The second possible language is, could it be Spanish, the colonizing language that was that came with the missionaries, for example? No, it's not Spanish either. Another third language possibility is Tagalog, or some other non-colonial language that the artisans may have spoken. It is not Tagalog either. And so this still remains a mystery for us. And if there are any language scholars out there in the audience, please let us know if you can give us a lead for further research. Now, I had mentioned that the sculpture eventually landed in Europe. The received record indicates that Henry Walters purchased the sculpture in 1903 in Venice, Italy. We don't know when the sculpture arrived in Italy, but we do know from where he bought the sculpture. Henry most likely purchased the Michael sculpture from Ferdinando Ongagna, who operated an antique shop and gallery on Piazza San Marco in Venice. And so the photo on the right shows the shop window of Ongagna's antique shop. So Ongagna was a Venetian publisher and bookseller, best known for publishing this monumental edition called Basilica San Marco, which celebrated the architectural history of the Basilica, Venice's most famous church. The photo on the left shows the front page of this publication. Ongagna published more than 170 books, mainly about Venice. He published out of his antique shop, which catered to an international clientele, one of whom was the Baltimore art collector Henry Walters. Ongagna often published several editions of his books in different languages and dedicated them to his important clients. So the Walters has 2 books published by Ongagna in our rare books collection, one of which does have a printed dedication to Henry Walters in the front. However, as of yet, we have not found a sales receipt or other documentation that verifies this purchase of the sculpture. So this is another area of continuing research on this object. And here I'm showing a couple of old photos that indicating that at one time the sculpture was on display at the museum, put above an archway off the court. So in this picture, we see that his left hand holds metal scales, and notice the sword in his raised right hand. The tip of the sword is pointing down. Now, I don't know if this is the case with the Filipino callus blade, but I do know that with the Indonesian kris, which is the cousin of the callus, it is believed that when unsheathed, the kris blade should always be pointing up. Otherwise, the downward pointed blade, which holds a lot of power, can cause catastrophes such as earthquakes. Now, I've lived in San Francisco for 10 years, and so when I saw this photo, I automatically felt anxious about the downward pointed blade. Now, the sculpture was taken down from the archway, and it was put in storage until it was displayed again in an Ivory exhibition in 1984. And during that exhibition, luckily, the dagger was pointing up. So after the 1984 exhibition, the sculpture then went back into storage, and it remained there for over 40 years, until it was recently installed in the Ford Collection Galleries at 1 West Mount Vernon Place in the Walters. It is now in conversation with some of the other Asian ivories in our collection that I've shown you previously. And so I do hope that you have a chance to view this sculpture in person if you're able. Now I will turn it over to Nina, who will delve into the art history and iconography of the sculpture of the Archangel Michael. Thank you, Nina. Hi.
Thank you, Dany. And thank you to the Walters Art Gallery for inviting me, or Art Museum for inviting me to participate in this conversation. The title of my talk is Connecting Empires, San Miguel Arcangel. This brief talk focuses first on the genealogy of the concept and visual expressions of Saint Michael the Archangel, and second, localizations of formal changes through time of sculptural forms in the Philippines from the from the 17th to the 19th centuries. I briefly argue that the idea and iconography of Saint Michael as protector linked disparate empires and their colonies through time and space. Next, please. Saint Michael is popularly known today in the Catholic world as the defender of the Virgin Mary and the Catholic Church. He is the highest ranking angel and leader of God's army. Textual references to Saint Michael are found in the Bible, notably in the book of Revelation. Saint Michael battles with Satan to protect the pregnant woman of the apocalypse, referencing the Virgin Mary, so that she may safely give birth to a male child. The Flemish artist Peter Paul Rubens portrays the literary narrative of the Virgin of the Apocalypse visually in this oil sketch entitled The Virgin as the Woman of the Apocalypse, circa 1623, for the main altar of the Freising Cathedral in Germany. A protective army of angels surround the mother and child, led by Saint Michael on the left, whose wings are thrust back as swirling drapes heighten his aggressive pose. He brandishes sword and shield and tramples on the serpentine beast. Similar images occur in other 17th century paintings. Next slide, please. This dynamic iconography by Guido Reni occurs in individual images of Saint Michael with stylized Roman soldiers' attire featuring figure-hugging breastplate, fringed sleeves, and overskirt referencing the leather strips for added protection. He often wears a sash draped across one shoulder, a cape, and Roman-style sandals or boots as he brandishes a sword and tramples the enemy. Next, please. As I focused on St. Michael's military regalia, I was struck by their similarity to representations of Roman soldiers, such as this Roman warrior on the right vanquishing the enemy at the Metropolitan Museum. Why would the leader of God's army, the Virgin Mary's protector, reference Roman soldiers, Roman warriors who arrested Jesus Christ? Next, please. The key might lie in intersections of Christian and pre-Christian ideas and iconography. Before Christianity, Greek and Roman gods dominated the realm that would later be subsumed by the Holy Roman Empire. The Roman god Mars, portrayed in Roman warriors' garments, bears many striking similarities and parallels to the Christian archangel. I would argue that the pre-Christian Mars, the military leader of the Roman Empire's pantheon of gods, and Saint Michael, the leader of God's army, are somehow intertwined in form and concept. In fact, recent ethnographic research by Anselmo Paoloni 2018 reveals intriguing conflation of Mars and Saint Michael in a Catholic procession honoring Saint Michael, the patron saint of Castelfiocco, a small village in Italy. The veneration of Saint Michael appears to intertwine with the continued importance of Mars in this village. An ancient altar to Mars, in fact, is suspected to lie beneath the Catholic Church. Thus, the protective Mars/Saint Michael connects the pre-Christian Roman world with the Holy Roman Empire and subsequently the Spanish Empire and her overseas colonies. Next, please. Next slide, please. The increasing popularity of printed copies of larger works in European churches, sorry, I think we need to go back to the other slide, made the transoceanic spread of images and ideas possible. In the late 16th century, Dutch and Flemish engravers dominated the print publishing houses, which had expanded and opened all over Europe. Jonathan Brown has noted printed replicas by Flemish engraver Hieronymus Wierix on the right of the oil painting of the Archangel Michael by Flemish artist Martin de Vos on the left, and recent research by Stephanie Porras traces the viral spread of this image. Next, please. The spread from Flanders to Spain is seen in this painting based on the print by Spanish Baroque painter Cristobal Vela, now in the Museum of Fine Arts in Cordoba. So you have this kind of circle where you start with the original oil painting that's in a larger format, which is replicated in a smaller print format, and the circulating print format is again replicated back into oil and various other iterations. Next slide, please. Across the Pacific, the same print seems to have generated sculptural iterations, such as this Filipino ivory San Miguel on the left, with upraised sword and distinctive skirt of leather strips over a flowing underskirt, open at the knees, such as that in the print after De Vos on the right. Next, please. On the left is another version of Saint Michael, print by Hieronymus Wierix, with slightly different posture and proportions, and notably without the flowing underskirt. That appears to have circulated beyond Flanders as well, generating other sculptural forms, such as the Filipino Archangel Michael in the Walters Art Museum on the right, a type that aligns more closely with this print version without the underskirt. Next, please. He brandishes a wavy sword or kris on top, right? A popular weapon in Southeast Asia. Note also the feline masks that adorn the boots of the Roman god Mars on the left that have mutated to cherubs on the right. Next slide, please. Our current knowledge of the relative dating and chronological styles of Filipino ivories are based on pioneering research in Spain by Margarita Estela Marcos and in the Philippines by Regalado Trota Jose and Esperanza Gatponton. The 17th century style is consistent with the example at the Walters Art Museum, featuring restrained movement, as you see here, such as this related example showing the distinctive wavy hairstyle with a curled forelock. He wears the usual Roman military regalia and wields a wavy sword aloft. The rear view on the right shows finely finished details, including the individual feathers of the wings, suggesting that this was meant to be seen in the round. Next, please. San Miguel ivories dated to the, let's see, a similar example from the same period on the right shows the characteristic stocky figure with limited movement, dressed in similar attire and almost identical posture. Next, please. In contrast, the San Miguel ivories dated to the 18th and 19th centuries display more slender, more animated figures aligned with the Baroque style, such as this 18th century example on the left. And note the fluttering underskirt that echoes details of the print by Filipino engraver Lorenzo Atlas on the right, dated 1751, indicating as well that by the 18th century, locally made prints by Filipino engravers were circulating in addition to imported Flemish prints. Next slide, please. San Miguel's popularity was such that the 19th century Ayala distillery named its iconic Ginebra San Miguel gin after St. Michael, carrying this image into secular life. Next, please. On the religious front, the National Shrine of St. Michael was the center of pilgrimages in Old Manila. Among the miracles attributed to San Miguel was the successful campaign in 1631 led by Spanish Governor General Sebastián Hurtado de Corcuera against Islamic populations in Mindanao. The image of St. Michael, the archangel in Manila, is also credited with diverting raging fires from destroying the shrine during the Battle of Manila in 1945, fought between the US and Japanese forces during World War II. The feast day of San Miguel Arcangel continues to be celebrated throughout the archipelago on September 29th, which in Iligan City on the right includes bringing down his statue for ritual bathing and dressing before special display and procession around the city with dancing and chants of Viva San Miguel greeting this image. Next, please. One of the highlights of these celebrations is the staging of the Comedia de San Miguel, a performance portraying the life of Saint Michael. Like the Spanish theater tradition known as Moros y Cristianos, there's dancing and staged battles between good and evil, featuring indigenous martial art forms as devotees pray for victory against all evil, which today might include prayers for victory over COVID-19 and all its variants. The San Miguel images used in these contemporary celebrations are of more modest materials, usually polychromed wood and custom-made fabric garments, for heirloom ivory images are now rare and found mostly in museums and private collections. Next, please. So this 17th century San Miguel from a private collection is being exhibited for the first time at Ayala Museum in an exhibition that I curated at the Ayala Museum entitled Intertwined Trans-Pacific Cultural Philippines, ongoing until 2022, and you can visit the exhibit virtually as well. Next slide, please. In closing, I'd like to share this exciting new volume on Trans-Pacific trade, which includes a number of essays on Filipino ivories that are now available for online purchase at the Ayala Museum, also from the Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence, and shortly at the Getty Research Institute, co-published by the Getty Research Institute and the Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence with Ayala Foundation. Thank you. I now turn the floor over to Julie.
Thank you, Nina. And Dany, I've already learned so much listening to the two of you. Good evening, everybody. I get to wrap up sort of our presentations and then move on to conversation, which is exciting. And bringing it back really to the Walters piece, the St. Michael, and thinking about a little bit more about its physicality and materiality, as Dany mentioned at the and I just like to point out that really the St. Michael sculpture, all of these St. Michael sculptures we've seen, they are they're amazing translations from 2D imagery that Nina showed, the prints. So they're amazing translations from 2D to 3D sculptural forms, and they are complex sculptural forms. So we're gonna look a little bit at that. As a conservator here, and that is my role here at the museum, the treatment of this piece was really led to a further exploration and study of the materials and techniques. So very exciting. And let's take a look. If we go to the next slide, we'll take a look again. We'll sort of bring it back to the object and look at it in the round a little bit more. And I do, Dany, I think this is a good question for us to talk about. I look at this piece, and because if we go to the next slide, I look at the fact that it is pretty fully carved in the round and decorated. And I do appreciate that the wings are not fully covered or painted in the back. I think it's something, I wonder if there was another covering in the back of the wings. So I do have a sense that this might have been meant to be seen in the round. So I think that's an interesting point of further discussion. Next slide. And then I love this angle because it, our beautiful photography looking down at sort of the devil figure. And again, I don't know if it really translates all that well in our images, the sheer size of this piece, over 40 inches in height. So it's a lot of ivory and an exceptional piece. So next slide, please. As we've mentioned already, again, the piece St. Michael figure is a complex construction made of ivory, which is elephant tusks. You see two images of tusks that are actually in the study collection here at the Walters. And then an image that I was able to take when I was visiting collections in Mexico City. This is from the Ayala Museum, a whole gallery of ivories. And what I think is really telling here is that you can see the curvature, how the natural curvature of the tusk is incorporated into this sculpture. So it's the sort of understanding of the physicality, of the understanding of the material itself. Next slide. And there, if we take a look, this is a great image, I think, to try and break down how St. Michael was put together. The image on the right is taken from an X-ray image that we took of the sculpture to begin to break down how many parts and pieces it was made of, and to try and estimate how many tusks we're seeing, and how many tusks it took to create this sculpture. The line drawing at the right, in the gray shaded areas that you see, and let's just look at the large gray shaded area at the center, it looks like a cone. That is the hollow, that's reflecting the hollow inner structure of a single tusk. That is actually the pulp cavity of a tusk, the living matter. And so by seeing in X-ray those hollows from the natural tusk form, we can actually say that that whole central portion of the figure of Michael, and he's leaning a little to the right, is made from a single very large tusk. So when we were examining this piece, we were estimating that it took at least 6 individual tusks to create this sculpture, perhaps even more. And you can begin to see the separate sections which it was made from and then assembled. And I'll just point out that the line drawing of the 2 legs, which you see each leg is a single large section, but then slotted into the underside of the skirt. Next slide, please. So dozens of pieces really that this is made from. Okay. The sections are carved separately and then mechanically pieced together, mechanically joined together. And I just show you this piece so you can see the seam of the upper extended arm, which joins the shoulder to that large singular section, that large torso, which is made from a single tusk of ivory. Next slide. And the techniques of joinery, I think, are really interesting because to me, they seem similar to those that you find in woodworking techniques. Perhaps the craftsmen also had skill knowledge in woodworking, but they're using dowels, basically dowel construction, and butterfly joints, and we'll look at that next. But it may be a little difficult to see, but if we look at the left leg, which is closest to us, goes straight up to the top of that leg, just beneath the skirt, you can see a circular plug that is an ivory dowel used to secure the leg within the structure. Next slide. And then if we return to the back of the ivory wings, which are each wing is actually assembled from 2 sections and then joined at the center. We're seeing actually 2 levels of construction here. Probably one is a repair. I think the original construction takes the form of these butterfly joints, which basically look like little butterflies that you can see on the right wing especially well at the top and the bottom. And next slide. And then looking closely at the sculpture, we also see how the craftspeople who were, and the artisans who were creating the sculpture really understand their material. They understood the material, and they used it very economically. They really, and in this slide, I'm showing the arrow points to an ivory insert. It's a very organic shape, but obviously there was a loss or maybe a flaw in the tusk. And this insert was skillfully carved and put in place. And then the next slide shows another set, a sort of more, it is a sort of rectilinear shape, but also an insert that was made in ivory and put within the skirt of the figure. So again, really making use, they knew it was ivory was a luxury material, it was an expensive material, so they were using all parts and pieces, and they really understood how to work with it very skillfully. Great to see. Next slide. And then, of course, we've mentioned before, but in addition to being a skillful sculptural, a complex sculpture, it is beautifully painted and gilded. And Dany mentioned early on, and it's so true, is that the craftsmen really made use of the quality of ivory, and ivory is fairly easy to carve. It takes a high polish well, and they really use that to an advantage in to create the flesh tones. But then you also see that the surface is painted and gilded. And what I love here about the detail of the face on the right is that, of course, the hair is beautifully carved, it's painted and gilded, but then you see the little wisps of paint on the forehead of St. Michael, and that is something that I've seen on similar sculpture from the same time period. And it's just a nice little detail to point out. Next slide, please. And then looking again at the sort of jeweled top of the breastplate here, this has been, a technique was used with a layer of gilding and then a transparent glaze or paint, a thin paint, to actually create this sort of jeweled effect. So it's very purposefully using different painting techniques to achieve different final results. Next slide. The wings themselves are one of the most highly ornamented or decorated pieces. Next slide. And then looking closely under the microscope, we could see that the barbs of the feathers are done in gilded lines. So they are lines of gilding. And then within the feather, to color, the feathers are actually colored over time. They've darkened, the colors have darkened. But looking under the microscope, you can go to the next slide, thank you. We have put together this fairly bright, but sort of schematic and color rendering of what we think the pattern of original colors may have been on the wings, which is really sort of exciting. Next slide, please. So bringing it together, really in terms of the work after our investigation, it was really all about putting this piece together to get it on view safely for the first time, as Dany said, in almost 40 years. And it really takes many hands at the museum. What I think is so exciting is that the figure of Michael has been laying down either on a shelf or in the lab for many years. And this past fall, or in actually 2020, one of the successes of COVID is that we were able to lift him up for the first time, and you can see us here assembling him for the first time in many years. Next slide, please. And then one of our fellows who did a lot of work on this is shown here, actually attaching the forearm of Michael on the right and doing some work there on the left on the wing. And these are images from the conservation labs at the Walters. And next slide. And then really the final step, and I'll sort of wrap it up here, the final step in our work is making sure that we support the object with a mount that keeps it safe and sound. And really, I think the work here done by our art handlers, they really created a work of sculpture in the mount that was befitting of the St. Michael. So you can see here, our art handler, Adam, working and piecing and fitting the mount to St. Michael. And you can see right now it's actually all painted in white. So you can sort of see how it stands out. The next couple of photos will show you how he's integrated that by painting in the surfaces. So next slide. This is a beautiful photo of St. Michael with the wings in place and the armature of the mount that was created here to support those wings safely. And that has been painted to really sort of, you can sort of step back and not see that. And then my last slide, I believe, shows you on the right, I think it's barely, I mean, they did a really great job. It's sort of barely perceptible. That mount, which is a considerable armature, has been painted with the design of the textile pattern on the back. So really, when you're standing and looking at the object, it's pretty imperceptible, but it really does the job of safe display for this beautiful piece. And you know, at this, just sort of as a wrap up, I feel like the many hands that went into the work and study of this object may in fact reflect the many hands and different artisans and craftspeople that whose hands were involved in creating it originally. So it's an object that has inspired a lot of great work and around the table tonight. So I'll take the moment now to bring Dany and Nina back for some Q&A.
Wonderful. Those were fantastic presentations. Thank you, Nina and Julie.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great.
And so
I think the three talks really covered different aspects of this particular sculpture, and it's quite exciting how we all intersect and address various aspects of this fabulous sculpture of St. Michael. Mm-hmm. Very rare.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. And you know, this is we are pioneering this new series, this focus on one object to offer the various different perspectives. And you're right, this is the perfect object to start off this potential new series. And so we have one question coming from In Pure Blue over at YouTube. They ask, would the inscription on the sculpture suggest the Hokkien language, which was one of the non-colonial languages of the ethnic Chinese people who lived in the Philippines during that time period? And based off of what I know of the Hokkien language, I would say no. Certainly this inscription, it looked and sounded more closer to a Latin-based language than a Chinese, a Mandarin, Cantonese, or Hokkien language.
Mm-hmm. And the inscriptions would be different as well. It wouldn't be using the Latin script.
Yes.
And I think it was interesting how we kind of pre-discussed this, Dany, right? And we've consulted our colleagues who might be more knowledgeable about these incantations, because I really suspect that it might have something to do with magical incantations that are similar to amulets that we have in the Philippines, where there's a pseudo Latin inscription that nobody can actually decipher because it is pseudo-Latin, and it's supposed to have apotropaic powers and endow, this magical protection. But what's really interesting, I think, and what makes this the Walters San Miguel very important and unique is that I'm not aware of other ivory sculptures, in particular Saint Michael, that have these inscriptions, although he seems to be a popular image in amulets, in traditional amulets that are, not precious materials, but they tend to be, even today, they're sold outside churches. And, they have these images of San Miguel, and they have these, prayer-like incantations. So there must be some connection, but it's very unusual to have this fabulous ivory sculpture of San Miguel with these, little incantations at the hem. And it kind of makes you wonder what else you can research in its, collection provenance and try to figure out at what point were those inscriptions added.
I think that's the question.
Were they
Yeah, that interests
original
me.
or
Yeah,
were they added later?
because they are from, again, the material, and they are it's done in a little bit of a different technique than the other painting, and a different color. So I am interested about when and by whom.
Yeah, that would be fascinating.
Yes.
And I hope if we have in the audience, people who are scholars who are interested in these magical amulets, anting, who might have, more clues regarding these inscriptions, please get in touch with the Walters Art Gallery and Dany and Julie.
Yeah, because usually the amulets are small, right? Like
Yes.
pieces. And so this being 40 inches tall is also another exceptional feature if it were an amulet.
Right.
Well,
I do have a question, if I may pose a question. I had a question for Julie. I was going to ask you how many tusks you thought were used for this amazing sculpture, but I think you mentioned that perhaps 7 tusks were used. So, well, one question is, is it possible to determine if those ivory tusks are all African? Do they all have the same source, or did they mix up the different types of ivories?
Right. It's a great question. And without doing sort of DNA tests to determine if it is Indian or African in terms of species, which we have not done, there are a few indicators. One is size. So we know, and there's different opinions really, so I don't want to quote a number in terms of Indian or Asian elephant, the diameter and sort of the extent of the size, but beyond that, and I would say the central tusk that was used for St. Michael, that major piece is a size that would indicate African elephant. So it is certainly possible that there's a combination of things. And I know there are also slightly different characteristics when it comes to African and Indian, Asian elephant in terms of described as a slightly different transparency and coloration, but those are all a little bit subjective. So I hate to go there without actual analysis, but I think I think we can indicate that there's certainly a possibility of both sources.
And if I may, I have a couple of follow-up questions to that. I was simply amazed by how well you and your team put together these pieces seamlessly. So the question is, and excuse my ignorance, does ivory not contract or expand depending on the changes in environment? The wood normally does. Is that one of the reasons why you were able to put this together so seamlessly?
I think that, so certainly it does have some dimensional change, and we'd be saying something different if we had archaeological ivory, which no longer has its organic component, but this is not that, right? Historic ivory still does have that. So we do watch and want it to be, we want to sort of maintain the relative humidity because it can shift and change. I think if the images were a little more blown up and zoomed in, you would see those joins. I mean, it wasn't as if many pieces were broken. It was the original assembly of sections that had come apart or had failed over time. So we were doing more of that kind of reconstruction. And when you look closely, it still reveals that to a certain extent, the construction.
Yeah. So follow up to that. My last question, I promise. I'm looking at how useful material studies could be, how much potential material studies would have in trying to determine the authorship and the place of manufacture of many of these images, because as you know, there's this ongoing debate on whether ivories were made by Spanish Filipinos in the Philippines, or by Chinese Filipinos, or by Chinese working in Guangzhou, or by
Mhm.
Chinese who are in the Philippines. So
Mhm,
perhaps
mhm.
one way of kind of arriving, kind of resolving all those questions might be if we looked at the materials used, for example, is there a way of tracing the kinds of adhesives that are used, the gilding, the sources of pigments? Do we know if is there a way of finding out if
Yeah,
these pigments are Asian or Chinese, or are they European,
yeah,
imported, from imported from Europe and coming to, because we do know that pigments are imported from Europe through the
yeah,
Italian trade,
yeah.
or are they pigments imported from China? And what kind of potential do you think studying all of those aspects would have in contributing, determining the place of manufacture and the authorship of these images?
Yeah, I love that question, and I won't go on too much about it. But part of when I started looking at the figure of St. Michael at the Walters, I was intrigued by the question of, could you separate out, was it carved in one location and then perhaps decorated elsewhere? Because that has been posed, and not a lot has been studied about, as you're saying, the pigments, the gilding. And so I did do sort of a survey of about 100 pieces of ivory of this type, not from Goa and the Philippines, where I have sort of documented at least the colors that are present, the tech is gilding present, et cetera, et cetera. Trying to answer, and then doing some material ID with our scientists here to try and answer those questions. Of course, as you can imagine, it's quite complicated because of the movement of ideas and people and materials.
Right,
The
right.
one thing that we have a little inkling is that we were looking at the adhesive for the gilding, and we have at least initially identified that it is, at least in one case, it is a Asian lacquer, which is to me, I love that, right? So that is telling me that those gilded lines, that painting decoration was done when it was still in the Philippines. So that's exciting. But I think the more collected information, sort of a database will help suss out the questions mentioning.
I'm glad for that answer, Julie, because one of our questions from the audience is from Ani Prozer, where she asks, would the gold used for the gilding have been local or imported?
Yeah. Well, and I know that Nina, you're probably a specialist in the gold in the Philippines, yes. But, so I won't say much about that other than I know it's there. We have not studied the actual composition of the gilding, but I do think that is also an avenue for more research. Yeah.
And that would require a lot more technical, like methods and new developments in technical methods, because gold is notoriously difficult to place in terms of origins of the gold mines.
Yeah,
That's
trace
something that's
element,
being worked on, and that's
yeah.
something that's quite difficult to determine where the original source of the gold is. But of course, we have a lot of gold in the Philippines, so it's impossible that the gold had to, or it's not likely that the gold would have to be imported from elsewhere, because we had a huge supply in gold. So yeah, but it would be really interesting to find out more about the sources of these pigments. And of course, you have to get used to how they look, right? I mean, we're so used to seeing them in white, and most collections in the Philippines have lost the color. It's a little bit like those Greek marbles, where you're so used to seeing it white, and then it's a huge shock when you see all these other colors, like your recreation of the wings with a green and the yellow.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why it was so fun to see the image that you showed of the contemporary, the contemporary photo taking out the Michael image for procession, because he is colorful.
He's all colored.
Yeah.
Right.
And I do love to see that in the paintings too. The wings are usually very multicolored too.
Right. And I've only seen one private, one St. Michael, huge one from a private collection that we borrowed for an exhibition in 2004, that had a lot of colors in the wings, red and yellow and green, which kind of threw me off, because it's like, oh, wow. I've never seen that, Yeah.
Great. So another question we have over at YouTube, I apologize if I mispronounce the first name, but From Virgilio Reyes Jr., they ask, it is interesting that the iconography seems to have been frozen from the 17th to the 20th century. Other saints seem to have more transformations or interpretations. How might you account for this?
And it's directed to whom?
I think it's a general question.
Ambassador Reyes, thank you for your question from the Philippines. That's a very interesting question, really. The iconography seems to have been, as you say, frozen in time. But I think part of it is because of the standardization of the way saints are depicted. And sometimes we kind of take it for granted that, oh, if it's Saint Michael, it has to look like this. If it's Immaculate Conception, she has to look like this. I'm guessing maybe what seems like more of a variation, a variety of different examples, for example, of the Virgin Mary images, might have to do with the wider popularity of devotion to her. And so there may have been several more um, European models through time of images of her. Whereas with the Saint Michael image, I'm not sure that there was such a wide variety of images that were circulating in the Spanish world. And it seems to me, from the studies that I've seen and from the pioneering studies of Jonathan Brown, and now the younger scholars, Stephanie Porras, Jesse Park, they're all looking at the different sources of St. Michael, which seems to be quite limited to these few Flemish prints mostly from the Hieronymus Vierix workshop, which seems to have been replicated throughout the Latin American world and then coming towards the Philippines. And of course, we didn't show the 19th century iterations, which are not as common in the local collections. But what we have normally in the Philippine collections and the ones sent overseas, seems to be from the 17th, mostly from the 17th century, mostly iterations similar to the Walters Art Museum. There are a few 18th and 19th centuries, but the ones that have survived seem to follow this conventionalized iconography from the 17th century. And this particular print by Vierix seems to be the preferred model for the image. Even your Ginebra San Miguel label follows that, that model. And even your current contemporary wooden images, polychrome wooden images, also seem to follow and emulate this 17th century ivory model that became the most popular conventionalized image.
So I think I want to finish our conversation with this one last question, which I really feel like takes us to the heart of, why we're focusing on this sculpture and the Michael image. So Colleen A. Backer over at Facebook asks, was the figure of Miguel Archangel particularly popular in 16th century Spanish colonies because the figure was especially appealing to native populations, or an effective messenger of Christianity from a Western missionary perspective? Because, we know that the Catholic religion took hold in the Philippines, but we also know that there were already native indigenous worship of deities. And so, I study East Asian Buddhism, Asian Buddhism. And so, we have a counterpart story whereby you can look at a popular bodhisattva or deity such as Avalokiteshvara, whereby, one of the main questions we ask is, how did the Buddhist deity Avalokiteshvara take hold, become popular in China, and it becomes Guanyin, an offshoot of that. And I feel like, was it because, Michael fit into a already existing deity, a mode of deity, or was he just a particularly effective messenger of Christian Catholic doctrine?
I think that's interesting that you draw the parallel with Avalokiteshvara and various other Hindu deities that are easily absorbed. And usually, when a new belief system becomes superposed on an existing culture, those that are easily absorbed or that intersect and align with existing beliefs are the most easily accepted, right? So, of course, the most popular concepts and images would be the Virgin Mary, the maternal mother, Jesus Christ, the supreme God. We have that concept of Bathala. And I'm guessing that, Saint Michael is one of the popular saints that we've kind of absorbed into our, Christian pantheon of saints, and I'm guessing that it's because of his role as protector. He's the protector of the church. He's the protector of the Virgin Mary, and so it's very easy to kind of be attracted to him as a protector of the country. So as a protector, and also I think he's also a convenient vehicle for example, you have these moro moro, these Spanish theatrical forms of staging plays that recreate a battle between the Moors and the Christian Spaniards. And there were during the colonial period, there were several edicts banning certain indigenous practices. One of them is the martial arts. The martial arts are Nis and all of these indigenous arts that are now popular in the US. So these were banned, and one way of having them survive and preserving them is by incorporating them into these stage plays. So the plays depicting the lives of Saint Michael and of these mock battles between the Moors and the Christians incorporate those indigenous forms of martial arts. So that's another aspect of it, that it disguise these indigenous forms and have them survive by hiding them through Catholic concepts. So maybe that was all also, part of the popularity of Saint Michael. And of course, all these miracles that are attributed to him, starting from the Spanish period, where he's credited with protecting Governor General Corcuera and being instrumental in defeating the Moors, Spain's enemies from the west, and then they encountered them again in the Philippines in the form of the Muslim population, and he protects the Philippines from the fires and destruction of World War II. By the way, he also protects the Ayala distilleries of the San Miguel gin, so and the whole San Miguel district. So I think this is really part of that, that whole popularity, because it's so easy to incorporate him in our daily life and in our religious life as well.
That is wonderful. Well, I'm sorry to break up this conversation, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for our program today. I thank you very much, Nina. Thank you, Julie, for
My pleasure.
your
Thank you, Dany. Yeah.
on this object and your expertise. I want to give a big thank you to our digital team for producing this program, and certainly an even bigger thank you to all of you, our audience, for sharing this experience with us. We welcome you back for more programs on our social platforms and for upcoming programs, including artist talks, curatorial lectures, performances, and more, please visit our website at thewalters.org. Thank you. Bye.
Good night.
Night.